Attention all grill masters and backyard barbecue enthusiasts. Lynn's has everything you need to make your 4th of July cookout a success. From sizzling certified Angus beef steaks and mouth-watering burgers to fresh-cut fruit and all the condiments you desire, we have you covered. Browse our weekly ad for celebratory savings like 39 cents per pound seedless watermelon through July 4th and shop online at lynsgrocery.com for extra convenience. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
This episode was first published on October 24th, 2023. 1948.
Soviet Union, yes. The United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means.
As a new Jewish state is born in the tense atmosphere of civil war. Haganah troops search for Arabs after capturing the city. Arab strong points are taken after being blasted to rubble.
No problem I faced while I was President of the United States was more controversial or more complex than the problem of Israel.
The Arab-Israeli conflict is about land. The first of many wars over this land began in 1948. And the fundamental problems caused by its outcome remain unresolved 75 years later. Jews emerged from that year with an independent homeland, the new state of Israel. Palestinians still stateless after decades of violence, vengeance, and an ultimately fruitless peace process. From 1948 to 2023, next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Hamas will understand that by attacking us, they've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them and Israel's other enemies for decades to come.
Why nothing is done when those killed are Palestinians? We need to think hard of what logic we want to see prevail here.
So displaced people occur in all wars. What turned displaced people into refugees is the refusal after the war, Israel's refusal to allow anybody to come back.
Maybe when the history of this period is written, I don't know, in a half century from now, there'll be an ending or resolution no one today can foresee. After all, in 1948, how many people predicted that in 1978, Israel and Egypt, after so many wars, would agree to peace?
We are privileged to witness tonight a significant achievement in the cause of peace. An achievement none thought possible a year ago, or even a month ago. An achievement that reflects the courage and wisdom of these two leaders.
Well, today, peace is distant as Israel prepares to possibly invade Gaza to crush Hamas. Gaza, the home since 1948 of Palestinian refugees. The problems caused by the events of that year are still unresolved. Actually, the trouble began in 1947, a brief but vicious civil war between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, then still under British control, which was collapsing. The UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and the newsreels were there to record the historic proceedings.
Partition of Palestine ends 7 months of deliberation by the United Nations and 2,000 years of political homelessness for the Jews. Tense vote on this way of settling immemorial strife between Jews and Arabs of the Holy Land is preceded by bitter debate. But for once, Russia's Andrei Gromyko sides with the United States. The Arab delegates declare a boycott as the final roll call has begun.
But what was happening in a meeting hall in New York did not magically create peace in Palestine. Arabs rejected the UN resolution. Once the British left once and for all in May 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the independent Jewish state of Israel. No one declared an independent Arab entity. Why? Well, we're going to get around to that in our conversation here with Ian Lustick. 5 Arab countries did invade to crush Israel in its cradle. The invasion failed, and some 750,000 Palestinians either fled or were driven out. These events continue to cast a shadow. We know history matters in the present. Origin stories matter. For the Jews, the creation of Israel was a historic achievement. For Palestinians, they call it the nakba, or catastrophe. 1948 still matters. Ian Lustick is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, an expert on this conflict and author of Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality. Hello, Ian Lustick.
My pleasure to be here.
So before we get to the history here, I'd like your thoughts on what's happening right now. Listeners can keep in mind that as I'm speaking into this microphone, it's not clear if and when an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza might begin. By the time you're listening to this, the war might have escalated to that point. But Ian, what do you think the consequences of a ground invasion by the IDF would be?
Well, I can tell you one consequence for sure, and that is they will not know how to get out. That's one reason you haven't seen it yet. And it's interesting that way you introduced it as maybe there'll be an invasion. Most of the press has been talking as if it's imminent, and it may be, but the longer it goes on without Israel moving in, the more likely it is that they won't actually move in. I still think they will, but they have about 6 reasons not to. And one of them is the one that I was referring to. Historically, and this is a show about history, Israel has a problem going into territories because governments then have to leave the territory without accomplishing what they said they were going to accomplish. Israel went into Lebanon in 1982 in order to end the Palestinian problem for 40 years and create a Christian government friendly to Israel in Beirut. It failed, but it stayed in Lebanon because if it left, the idea is that we're going to turn over the territory to the terrorists because they hadn't been wiped out. Now it wasn't so much the PLO, but it was Hezbollah. Do you know how many years it was before Israel left Lebanon? 18 years. Very good.
I was going to say 20, yeah.
Well, you were close. 18 years. And of course, even then, in 2000, when Barak ordered the last withdrawal, he suffered politically for doing that. Ben-Gurion had to get out of Gaza and Sinai in a humiliating way in 1957 when the United States and the Soviet Union told him he had to leave. Israel has not ever gotten out of the West Bank or most of Golan. It got out of Sinai with a lot of difficulty. It is the case many times that Israel has gone into Gaza and it's come out and had to returned. And it never fixes the problem. Usually, since it's a political problem, it has no military solution. In this context, then, what is Israel going to do? If it goes in, it will endanger the hostages, and a lot of them are not Israeli, which complicates Israel's public relations with Europe and the United States. That's one problem, the hostages. And of course, most of the hostages are Israeli, and there are already demonstrations, prisoner swap now. And Israel is very busy on that front. You can say arresting, or you could say abducting Palestinians. There were 5,200 Palestinians in Israeli jails before October 7th. 5,200. There are now over 10,000, about doubled, if not more than doubled, the prisoner population of Palestinians, building up, people to trade with. So on that front, we may be seeing that happening. Another problem is that they would be responsible for humanitarian assistance. There are still civilians left, and if they haven't left already, they can't leave, and Israel will be caught there. That's another problem. They don't know what to do about caring for civilians. They certainly don't know what to do later about ruling the place. Another problem, and this is a bigger one, is how many Israeli soldiers will be killed. Israeli units are operating in Gaza now, inside Gaza, very small reconnaissance units. And apparently they sent at least one tank in, and that tank was hit by an anti-tank missile that killed one Israeli soldier and wounded 3 more. Now, in the Yom Kippur War, 1973, I was in Israel at that time. One of the shocks of the war was that when Israel sent its relief tank divisions toward the canal, hundreds of Egyptian soldiers popped out of the desert with handheld anti-tank Sagger weapons and destroyed the Israeli tanks. This is another thing they're worried about, that this is what Hamas is waiting for. So there's a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Biden is telling them not to.
Yeah, I agree with you. There are no military solutions to what is a political problem and a dispute over land, unless Israel, as you say, wants to try to take on reoccupying all or part of Gaza, and then what? But I'm not sure it's possible to destroy Hamas.
You know, probably if you mean destroy all the people who identify with Hamas, no. If you mean destroy enough of the infrastructure and the leadership so that it has to be reconstituted, possibly as an organization with a different name, that is possible. But the Muslim Brotherhood is what produced Hamas. Hamas is not a very old organization. It started in 1987, 88 during the Intifada, when the Muslim Brotherhood that Israel actually facilitated and supported.
That's right.
Because they saw it as a power balancer, a counterweight to the PLO. It decided that it was losing the battle for the young Palestinian generation because it wasn't sufficiently militant in its struggle against Israel. So when the secular United Command of the Uprising started to attract mass support in the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, the Muslim Brotherhood created Hamas as a front organization. It has since essentially displaced the Muslim Brotherhood and become the governing apparatus of Gaza, and that happened because it won an election in 2006 that defeated Fatah. 2, it survived a coup attempt against it by the United States, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority. And 3, it has received tremendous support from the Israeli government in the last 10 years or so to rule Gaza in a way that would prevent the Palestinians from having a united front. The Israeli government that doesn't want negotiations can always say, and has said, we can't negotiate because the Palestinians aren't united. So a key part of Netanyahu's strategy has been to strengthen Hamas in Gaza as long as Gaza remains blockaded and the people immiserated and dependent on what Hamas can hand out.
That's right. I recently did an episode, Hamas, with Nathan Brown, George Washington University, about how in the early days of this movement, the Israelis did not see it as a security threat because, hey, these guys are going to go to the mosques and leave us alone.
Which is kind of amusing, since that was Ben-Gurion's attitude toward the rabbis, that the religious Zionists or the religious in Israel would not cause any problems, they'd fade away, only to see after the Six-Day War the Messianic Jewish fundamentalism take over and move the Israeli political system far to the right, added to the ultra-Orthodox who have so much political clout in Israel today. So the underestimation of what religiously affiliated people are capable of in the modern era is common to both the Palestinian and the Israeli side.
Yeah, I'm not happy with the lack of awareness or recognition of the role of religion in all of this. It is a war or a conflict over land, but religious fundamentalism or fanaticism informs each side. You know, that's my personal bias as a non-believer who opposes all religions and religious causes.
And I suppose you're equally bothered by nationalist fanaticism.
Yes, I am. Yes.
Because you don't have to be religious to be a fanatic.
That's true. So we're going to talk about origins here, the origins of today's war. And you can roll the clock back, and people like to do that and stop it where it's convenient for their argument. We're going to start in 1947-48, but I really thought we needed to briefly go over 1917 and the Balfour Declaration. Sykes-Picot, not to turn this, not to turn this into an encyclopedic, 4-hour-long podcast, but these events and developments were really important on the road to the Second World War and then 1948. So the Balfour Declaration, how did that complicate matters on the ground between Jews and Arabs, and what became the British Mandate of Palestine?
Okay. The first thing your audience needs to know about this is that this is what the story I'm going to tell about the Balfour Declaration is a typical story of how imperialist countries deal with third world areas. They are very casual and accidental about it because their interests are much bigger. Each country, whether it's Britain, France, Germany, are worried about the other great powers. When a country like Angola or India or Palestine or Syria come into their view, It's only if they intersect with their real problems. And then whatever happens to be in the minds of those people who are in charge of policy at that time, they will make decisions, but they're relatively casual and accidental. It feels to the people who live in these areas like the imperial power has made some kind of profound decision about them, but actually it's more or less an accident. Well, let's see what I mean in this case. Britain is fighting a death struggle with Germany in World War I, starts in 1914. Generations of men are being destroyed. The Germans, the British, the French. And the United States, although in 1917 it officially entered the war, had hardly sent any troops. And things did not look good on the Western Front. And it looked like the Russians, who were fighting with the British and the French on their side, might drop out of the war because the Bolsheviks were taking power. Were about to take power if the Tsar left the war, Germany would be able to put all its power against France and Britain. In that context, it's all hands on deck. What can you do to help us now? So whether you were stationed in Iraq or you were stationed in Cairo or in India, whoever you were thinking, how can I help? So one idea that came about was we've got to raise an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a weak partner of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians in the war. Getting Ottoman Empire out of the war would be great, weakening them and preventing the Ottomans, a Muslim empire, from calling upon British troops in India who were Muslims to revolt against the British. That's all the British needed. So the British found a very prestigious man in Arabia named Hussein ibn Ali and bribed him into raising a revolt, the Lawrence of Arabia, Revolt in the Desert, if anybody's seen the movie, to lead the Arabs to independence in the whole Middle East against the Ottoman Empire. And the British promised the Arabs that they would support independence in the lands that they helped liberate and respect Arab ambitions for independence. At the same time, they needed to pay the French because the French were losing even more people on the Western Front, and the French wanted parts of the Ottoman Empire. So the British and the French secretly made a deal with one another, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and they had already made the promises to Hussein ibn Ali through Lawrence of Arabia. Now they made promises to the French to divide the Middle East. After the war, Britain would have influence or control Iraq and Palestine and Jordan, and Syria and Lebanon would be under a French control or domination. So then there's the Zionists who wanted to have Palestine as a Jewish state. They went to the British and they said, if you do give us your support, the Jews in Russia will keep Russia in the war, which was completely ridiculous. Most of the, absolutely ridiculous. But from a British point of view, desperate for any help, that's a good idea. Okay. And also the American Jews will love Britain if they promise Palestine to the Zionists, and they'll get more American troops sooner into the war.
So the Zionists were playing on anti-Semitism in a weird way, right? Playing on people's suspicions of powerful Jews, right?
The trope of, yes, that's true in the Russian case. But yes, then the question was, well, what could Britain do? Now, at that time, Britain was ruled by Lloyd George, who happened to be a millenarian. That is, a Christian who believes in 2,000-year cycles or 1,000-year cycles, and it looks forward to the coming of the Messiah. And he felt it would be great if Jews went back to Palestine. So he was very sympathetic to this idea. On the other hand, other people in the cabinet, in the war cabinet, were afraid that they would be alienating the Arabs tremendously, and they would be abrogating the promises they made to the French. So the British watered down what the Zionists wanted. They wanted Palestine promised as a Jewish country, a state. Instead, they said His Majesty's government would look with favor on the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So maybe there'd be many national homes, whatever that is, in the world, and one of them would be in Palestine, and Britain would facilitate that as long as the religious and civil rights of the non-Jewish populations were respected. It didn't say anything about political rights. So this was a compromise which wasn't really related to what was going on in Palestine or what the Palestinian Arabs wanted. In fact, Martin, when the British issued this declaration in November 1917, they were not yet in control of Palestine. The Ottomans still ruled Palestine. When the declaration came out, the Zionist movement was at first very upset about it because they'd left out a lot of the language. But they quickly retranslated it into Hebrew in ways that made it sound like the declaration was promising a state. Anyway, that's where the Balfour Declaration came. After the Bolsheviks threw the Tsar out, they published the secret treaties showing that the British had promised Palestine to 3 different people.
Yeah, and the Russians dropped out of the war anyway, so much for that promise.
That was always absurd.
Yeah.
All of those were absurd. What I'm trying to drive is that when an imperial power is worried about a war with another imperial power, it doesn't think very well. Gee, is this really going to work? They just do it. Do anything that might help. It's like throwing everything against the wall and seeing what will stick. And the Balfour Declaration was one of those things that threw against the wall.
And what I'm driving at here, along with the settlement at San Remo, the San Remo conference, I was 1920 or 22, I can't remember, the mistrust that these agreements, declarations sowed. I'm just going to share a couple of sentences from the conclusion of Jonathan Schneer's book, The Balfour Declaration. He said, the Zionists and many others viewed it as a terrific achievement, a foundation stone along the way to the establishment of modern Israel. Many Arabs, on the other hand, have seen it as a terrible setback, the real starting point of their dispossession and misery. An equally consequential result of the process was the development of profound mistrust of all parties by all parties, and growing from that mistrust, a bitterness that would lead to the spilling of much blood. He goes on to say that as for the majority of Palestinian Arabs, they directed their resentments against Jews whom they thought were stealing their land, and against British officials whom they thought were protecting the Jews. And this is as the 1920s are unfolding and Jewish immigration picks up. I said we were going to start in 47, 48, but we rolled the clock back to the Balfour Declaration just to show from this early point the mistrust that was there.
And the nickname that Britain has in the Middle East is Perfidious Albion. Albion is the old Latin name for Britain. And it comes down to all of these contradictory promises. Although if you look at the French, they're just as bad in terms of consistent promises.
Why did the British later restrict Jewish immigration?
So it's a little wrong to say that everything started with the Balfour Declaration. There were already 50,000 Jews, Zionists in Palestine about, and there was a lot of Arab opposition, Palestinian opposition to Zionism even before the Balfour Declaration. But let's go forward from there. Britain takes over as the mandate, the mandatory power. Under the League of Nations, there was not supposed to be any more colonialism. One of the reasons for the Balfour Declaration that I didn't mention is that by saying Palestine would be the national home of the Jewish people, Britain could plan on ruling Palestine in its own as a colony, but treating it as if it was respecting a nationalist self-determination imperative, and thereby stay on the good graces of Woodrow Wilson, who believed in national self-determination. So they were playing the new nationalist discourse game with the Balfour Declaration. That's also why then Britain takes over as the mandatory authority. It was a Class A mandate. That means that the people were far advanced enough that Britain was just supposed to ease the way toward independence, to tutor them. It ended up that the mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration, which was a very fateful decision by the League of Nations, which never allowed delegations or testimony from the Arabs in Palestine and Syria to be heard by the League of Nations. And Wilson was pretty ignorant of this. So the Balfour Declaration meant Britain had to facilitate somehow the national home. And that meant allowing Jews to come in the country, and then how many would be allowed? And would they be allowed to buy land or accumulate land? And the problem was when they said, well, we're going to just buy land. We're going to buy it freely and we'll pay a high price for it. But the land law in the Ottoman Empire had changed in the mid-19th century because the British and the French demanded payment of loans, and the Ottoman Empire had no money. So the British and the French took over all the debts of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was run by the Europeans. And in order to raise money, they forced the empire to change its land laws. So instead of the Sultan owning all the land and just letting people use it, everybody's allowed to have the ownership of the land, something that people didn't really understand. Well, the peasants only knew that they were allowed to use the land and they would give a share of their crop to the government. Now they were told by their local strongmen, no, things have changed. You have to sign this little piece of paper and everything will be the same. You sign this paper and I'll deal with the government. But the government, if you don't sign this paper, the government will come and tax you for your land. The peasants were terrified. What, I have to deal with the government? So these landlords in the late 19th century gathered tremendous tracts of land in Palestine. They didn't farm them, but that means they had the deeds to them when the Zionists came. If you wanted to buy land, you couldn't buy it from the villagers because they wouldn't sell you their land. You had to buy it from the absentee landowners who had collected it. And a condition of buying the land was, we will pay you the money if you get rid of the people who are living on the land, who had no legal right to be there anymore, because they were, although they thought it was just the same as before, they were just tenants. And so what happened is that there would be violence against Jews and against Zionism, based a lot on the displacement of Arabs who felt their land had been stolen. The Jews said, no, we didn't steal it, we bought it. And then there would be violence. So then the British would send an investigating commission. Why is there violence in Palestine? What's going on with these strange people who were ruling? Why is there violence? The Shaw Commission, the Peel Commission, the Passfield White Paper, the Woodhead Commission, all of these commissions, every one of them, the same thing happened. The commission would go there, they would interview people, and they would write a report. And the report said the reason for the unrest and the violence is because the Arabs here oppose Zionism. Zionism should be restricted so that we don't have all this violence. The next thing, and then the Zionist movement, which had few people in Palestine but a lot of power in London, went to the British government and said, if you don't reverse the recommendations of the commission, we will not support you for re-election, and put tremendous pressure on the government in Britain. So what happened is every set of recommendations either was only partially implemented or was reversed. You get violence again and another investigating commission and start the whole cycle again. In other words, the colonial officers of Britain came to see that there was so much opposition to Zionism that was causing the violence. But in Britain and London, that's where the Zionist movement had a lot of power, sort of like the way Israel has a lot of clout in the United States, much more than the Arabs do because of politics. The same thing it was in Britain.
So I was going to ask you about the demographic makeup of Palestine by 1945, but it sounds like during this period that Jews and Arabs weren't really living together. They were in the same piece of land, but not really coexisting. They were living...
So that's a complicated question. Yeah. I'm sorry, so much is complicated. If you go back to the Ottoman period, when Zionists are coming in, they're trying to form what's called the new Yishuv. Yishuv is a Hebrew word that means the settlement, the community, the Jewish community. The old Yishuv, that is the non-Zionist, a few tens of thousands of Jews who were mostly religious and living in a few holy cities, they got along very well. Many of them spoke Arabic. They were one interlocking community with Christians and Jews. Religion was the most important thing in their lives. Those Jews weren't at all interested in trying to change the character of the country. As the Zionists came in, they looked at the Arabs as their enemy, from whom they had to take the country. And they looked down on the religious Jews of the old Yishuv, or many of whom were Mizrahi Jews, that is, Jews who didn't speak Yiddish. Their ancestors came from the Middle East, so they spoke Ladino or Arabic, very foreign to these Muscovites, as they called the new Jewish immigrants from Russia, the Muscovites, who seemed very crude and ideological and not polite and discourteous. They had chips on their shoulder. They were fighting to take a country under their control. So then relations between Jews and Arabs started to polarize, especially as the old Yishuv got pushed to the background and the new Yishuv grew. It grew by leaps and bounds in the 1930s because of the rise of Hitler and the arrival of a new high commissioner who was very sympathetic to Zionism in the early 30s. In that context, the warnings that were coming from new Arab political organizations that Zionism was taking over the country became so convincing to most Arabs that in the mid-30s there was a 6-month general strike and then a full-scale armed revolt against Britain, mainly to try to end the mandate. The British would have liked to have had some kind of legislative assembly to try to groom the thing toward democracy. But they're yet a problem because, in principle, the Jews were Democrats and it should be a democracy. But their definition of the problem of Palestine, the Jewish definition, the Zionist definition, was completely different from the definition that the British and the Palestinians used. Their definition was that the problem of Palestine is the problem of world Jewry, period. That if you're going to vote on the future of Palestine, all Jews throughout the world should vote. From the Palestinian point of view, The problem with Palestine was the problem of what do you do with this territory and the people who are living there. It's the same as the problem of Bosnia or the problem of Syria or Iraq or Mesopotamia, any other former colony. How do you get self-determination according to Wilsonian principles? Well, Zionism said, no, it is a Wilsonian problem, but it doesn't involve the people who are living here. The people who are living here who are not Jewish, it's an accident. Now, the British, how did they define the problem? From their point of view, this is a typical imperial colonial problem. We've got all these weird people living here, and they all have different ideas about things, and they're not really civilized like us. They're going to give us headaches after headaches. So we'll keep studying the problem and try to come up with this or that way to be fair until something happens in the outside world that forces us to do something. And what forced the British to do something in the mid-30s when the Arabs revolted is the specter of World War II on the horizon, the rise of Hitler. Then it seemed Palestine is going to be necessary as a military base to defend the canal and to supply British forces throughout the Middle East. That meant the British sent a lot of troops and absolutely crushed the Arab rebellion.
I was going to ask, what caused that revolt? Was it these land issues that we've been discussing?
Yes, it was mainly the land issues, and now you have 400,000 Jews, very well organized, with military assets that had partly been groomed by the British and partly developed by themselves, now accumulating more and more land with more and more displaced tenants and making no bones about the fact that they want to run the country. And they don't put any limit on what that country means, and they're not clear what they have in mind is going to happen to the Arabs. The idea that it'll be possible to transfer out of Palestine or out of a Jewish state a lot of Palestinian Arabs started to be believed by people like Ben-Gurion, partly because the British mentioned it in one of their reports as a possibility.
There are still many more Arabs in Palestine than Jews at this point.
No.
Okay.
Right now, from the river to the sea, that is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, there are about 7 million Jews. And there are a little more than 7 million Palestinian Arabs.
I'm sorry. When I said at this point, I meant 1940s.
Oh, I'm sorry. Back then, yes.
Yeah.
Well, back then there were about, let's say in the 30s, 400,000 Jews and about probably 1 million Arabs.
But not as well organized.
No. The main reason the revolt failed was that the British killed 10,000 Palestinian Arabs and destroyed their military capacity for generations. That's the main reason. But another reason is that the Palestinian Arabs were divided into clans, into kinship networks that were ferociously fighting with one another. They weren't entirely united. Now, that's because that's typical in the Middle East. Before nationalism really reorganizes or modernity completely reorganizes a country, the old traditional networks and the Zionist agents and the British played on those divisions to divide the Nashashibis from the Husseinis and this tribe and that tribe. They did a very good job of that. So at one point, more Arabs were being killed by other Arabs than the Arabs were killing Jews or British.
Well, we don't have time to cover everything in detail here. You mentioned the Peel Commission, and my listeners can look these up. There was a white paper of the Chamberlain government in 1939.
Well, let's say something about that because that shows something important. On the one hand, the British, I said, now they've got a monster on their hands, something they really care about, Hitler. So they do whatever it takes in Palestine. On the one hand, they crush the Arabs, but on the other hand, they issued the 1939 white paper, which closes the doors of Palestine to Zionism after 5 years. So they were ready to be decisive when their real interests come into play. It's no longer an accident of what this or that colonial officer, what scheme they come up with.
Yeah, I mentioned how they sought to restrict immigration by Zionists to
only
Palestine.
15,000 Jews a year, and then in 5 years it'd be up to the state of Palestine to decide whether it'd be any more.
Because they realize, this is causing problems that we don't really want to deal with as we try to rule this mandate. Alas, 1945 and the Allied victory in World War II and, the British and French. Long story short, they're exhausted by the war and the era of decolonization begins. And as the world begins to learn of the Nazis' crimes against the Jews, the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews in Europe, according to William Cleveland, whose book I've been using quite a bit lately, A History of the Modern Middle East, the Jewish settlement in Palestine, they determined that the British presence there was the primary obstacle to establishing a Jewish national home. So earlier they needed the Brits for the Balfour Declaration. Now World War II is over and the British are in our way. So there were Jewish groups, Irgun, the Stern Gang, Haganah, they've been called terrorist groups. They instigate a campaign of sabotage beginning in 1945 against the British administration. What were they hoping to accomplish with this?
During World War II, of course, the Jews had very little options but to side with the British. But the British were keeping Jews out of Palestine. So Ben-Gurion, under the Haganah, Ben-Gurion was the main leader of the labor Zionist camp, and the army it developed was called the Haganah. And it had a strike force called the Palmach. His strategy was to fight the white paper as if there were no war and fight the war as if there were no white paper. So in part, they cooperated with the British, but they were constantly trying to smuggle Jews into Palestine and prepare a war that would determine the fate of Palestine. The Irgun was under Menachem Begin. The Zionist movement was divided in many ways, but the biggest division was between the revisionists, meaning the right-wing Zionists, who actually saw in Mussolini someone who was admirable for his discipline and his order and his militarism, and the socialist Zionists, who were mainly in power, like Ben-Gurion, and people like Weizmann, who were kind of in the middle, liberal capitalist Zionists. Now, the Irgun under Begin was much more anti-British than Ben-Gurion. They were willing to attack the British inside Palestine, kill British officers, even hang them, whip them, and the British retaliated.
King David Hotel, right? The Irgun blows up part of that hotel.
We're getting to that. Yeah. The Irgun was also ready to use terrorism against Arabs. It would roll barrel bombs down into Arab markets. They killed hundreds and hundreds of Arabs that way. But they also attacked the British. At one point, there was a war between the Haganah and the Irgun. Haganah felt that the Irgun was interfering with its policies. But there was also, in what you refer to later as the Jewish Revolt, in which the Irgun and Haganah effectively joined in a revolt against the British. And it resulted in a crackdown by the British on Zionists. Now, the crackdown that the British made on the Zionist movement was to incarcerate about 1,000 Zionists. Nothing like the killing of 10,000 Arabs that had occurred when they cracked down on the revolt in the 30s. And Ben-Gurion was out of the country, so the Zionist movement survived and benefited from world opinion about the refugees from the Holocaust. The demand to allow 100,000 displaced persons to come into Palestine after World War II. For those in the audience who know about the Exodus was a Haganah ship to take advantage of world sympathy for Jewish survivors and to put the British on the spot, because the British turned the Exodus around and sent them back to Europe because the British had become sick and tired of the whole problem. And they went to the UN and said, okay, we're going to end the mandate. You figure out what you want to do with it. And it was in that context that more and more pressure to bring Jewish refugees from Europe into Palestine was mounted.
And I mentioned the sabotage campaign 1945 to 47. In February of 47, as you said, the British Foreign Secretary Bevan, he refers this matter to the UN, and then the UN takes a long time, months, right, to figure out what to do. Did the Palestinian Arabs have a strong voice or any prominent leaders involved in the UN negotiations here?
Yes, they did. And Arabs in general, though, made some very eloquent testimony. Albert Harani is one of them. Remember, I've told you that the British sent many investigating commissions to Palestine. Well, now two others, the Anglo-American Investigating Committee and the Morrison-Grady Committee. So this was yet another one, the UN Special Committee on Palestine. It studied the problem for 5 months. It had a lot of testimony from Zionists, Ben-Gurion, Moshe Sharet, others, and from Palestinians, and especially from Arab spokesmen. And they were completely talking past each other. Because from the Zionist point of view, the problem of Palestine was, as I said, the problem of all Jews. So don't pay attention to the fact that Arabs are living there. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is that the world has a Jewish problem, and the solution to it is a national state for Jews in Palestine. And so all of Palestine should be a Jewish state. The Arabs said, well, that is ridiculous. Rules that apply to every other country have to apply to Palestine as well. So you ask the people who are living there, a big majority of Arabs here, so let's have a referendum and a plebiscite and independence. So the two sides just talk right past each other. The UN committee was split. the third world countries, the countries that weren't strongly aligned with either side and who had some connection to the Muslim world, like India or others, Yugoslavia, would favor a binational state. Palestine would remain a state. Jews and Arabs would have equal rights in the state.
But ultimately, the UN decides to, or votes to, partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, right?
It was very difficult to divide it in a way that made all the Jews live together because there were many more Arabs. So what they did was any places the Jews lived, almost all of them went to the Jews. That meant that a very large number, maybe 450, 500,000 Arabs were going to be in the Jewish state. But the UN figured, well, there'll be a lot of Jewish refugees coming in, so there'll be a large Arab minority in the Jewish state. There would be almost no Jews in the Arab state. Ben-Gurion said, this is great, but we don't necessarily accept the borders that you've drawn, because the borders were very complicated, and they were intended to make it impossible to have two states without the economic cooperation. In fact, the UN, it approved this by a narrow vote because of two reasons. One, suddenly the Soviet Union decided to support partition. They had always opposed it. They had always favored binational state. But suddenly the Soviet Union said, no, we're not a Jewish state. The reason they did it is because they decided they didn't like the British in Palestine anymore, and the Jews were fighting the British now. So they thought a Jewish state would be an ally against the British. They were wrong, but that's why they did it. And the United States, because of the political pressure that was able to be put on Truman, also supported, but barely, partition. And American diplomats went on an all-out offensive to pressure countries like Guatemala that were dependent on us, that didn't really know or care much about the Middle East, to vote in the UN for the partition resolution. And that's why it passed. But what the UN didn't do is it never made any provision for how to implement this two-state solution. There was no Palestinian group that could take over. There was no Palestinian representative that was saying, yes, we accept partition. And the Zionist groups had already developed plans for how to take over much of the territory that had been allotted to the Palestinian state as soon as possible. So once the UN put forward its recommendation, the British announced they were leaving, and they didn't give very much thought to how they would leave. They would just leave to protect British soldiers, evacuate city after city, and in each city, the Arabs and the Jews would start fighting. So civil war broke out in December 1947, right after the partition resolution, and lasted more and more viciously. Atrocities on both sides, including massacres of whole villages and hospital convoys, until May of 1948.
That's right.
That's when Israel declared independence and the Arab states invaded.
And the amazing thing about this, there was nothing for the British to hand over to, right? Because they never established anything. There was no government, a transitional government, when they decided to leave in May of 1948. So partition in 47 in the UN, the British finally leave in May of 1948. Ben-Gurion and the Zionists announced that they're establishing an independent Jewish state, but there's no Palestinian state.
There are people in Israel, on the left usually, who say the reason the British did what they did is not because they really wanted to leave Palestine. They just wanted chaos in Palestine to prove to the UN that it wasn't the British fault that there was chaos. There just was chaos there. And the problem was the Balfour Declaration. So there are those who say that what the British really wanted is to have partition fail and have the UN come back to Britain and say, okay, you can have Palestine again as a UN trusteeship, but you can rule it how you want. We're not going to insist on the Balfour Declaration. We're not going to insist on a Jewish national home. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I kind of doubt it, but you can interpret history that way because the British certainly left in a way to maximize the potential for a civil war. And that's what you really had, was a civil war. Most of the refugees who are in Gaza came as a result of several operations, Operation Dani and Operation Plan Dalet, which the Haganah put into effect to conquer areas that were in the south, from Jaffa down toward Ashkelon, it used to be Majdal, and from Ramla and Lud, and make those areas part of the Jewish state and get rid of as many Arabs from that area as possible. Most of those Arabs who escaped, many of them, they went to Gaza. And they came to outnumber the local population of Gaza 2 or 3 to 1 as a result of the 1948 war. There were other operations later in the war because the entire area around Gaza, all the way up to Ashdod and all the way toward Beersheba, that whole northwestern part of the Negev, including Gaza, was supposed to be part of the Arab state.
This is a really important point in this story. Talking May 1948 and the start of the first Arab-Israeli war, when 5 Arab states invade the new state of Israel as proclaimed by Ben-Gurion, and what happened to the 700,000 or so Palestinians who either fled or were forced out of their homes in 1948. There were 2 main periods of fighting. The war didn't go on for that long, and then armistice agreements were signed with the Arab invaders. Those were wrapped up by 1949. So this is a very, compacted period of time. Once again, I'll read from William Cleveland. He says, once the Arab flight had started, so Palestinians are fleeing a war zone. It was encouraged by the Haganah in order to secure the interior of the Israeli state and protect Jewish settlements lying outside its UN-decreed borders. The Haganah in April 1948 authorized a campaign against potentially hostile Arab villages. Known as Plan D, the campaign provided for the conquest and permanent occupation or leveling of Arab villages and towns. Haganah field officers interpreted Plan D as giving them authority to undertake the systematic expulsion of the Palestinian Arabs living within the area allocated to the Jewish state, as well as those whose villages were situated just inside the territory awarded to the Arab state. So this is what Palestinians call the nakba today. And do you agree with how Cleveland described what happened there, that this was expulsion?
Effectively, yes, but it's not me that agrees with it. It's the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. After the war, as Benny Morris has shown, or actually in the middle of the war, in June, before many of the Arabs were expelled, there had been hundreds of thousands who had fled or been expelled. And the IDF did a study. Why did the Arabs flee? And they came up with 10 reasons. None of them were because the Arab leaders told them to leave. That's a myth. The main reason was they were expelled, forcibly expelled, or they were intimidated, scared purposely into leaving. That's what the army found out right in June 1948. We now know it for sure, and in the reference to Plan D, that is Plan Dalet, I refer to it in the Hebrew. But one of the things that people don't understand is this. All of this ink has been spilled on were they expelled or did they flee? They were expelled, but that doesn't matter. That's really not very important. I'll tell you what's important. All wars, including this one, involve displaced people. 120,000 Israelis have been displaced, have fled from the border towns around the Gaza Strip and around Lebanon. 120,000 already, not to speak of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have fled south in Gaza, trying to get out. So displaced people occur in all wars. What turned displaced people into refugees is the refusal after the war, Israel's refusal to allow anybody to come back. Thousands of Arabs trying to come back were shot by the Israelis as infiltrators, and they were afraid of them as marauders. They were coming back to try to live in their villages. Many of them, about 10, 15, 20,000, succeeded in staying in Israel, but 750,000 ended up not being able to. That refugee problem, that historic refugee problem, was caused not by the fact that they fled or were expelled. It was caused by the fact that they weren't allowed to return.
A lot has happened in the past 75 years, but wouldn't you say that this is the fundamental issue today, even today, what happened in 48?
Yes, well, one of the new things that has happened because of the failure of the two-state solution, for many decades, for several decades, I fought hard. There should be 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. Partition, using the West Bank and Gaza as the Arab state, with East Jerusalem as its capital. In that way, although it's not complete justice for anybody, it's minimally satisfactory to each side. And I warned, as did many others, that if this were not achieved, that there would not be able to be a Jewish state in the Middle East, and that there would be war for a long time. And about 10 years ago, I came to the conclusion that, okay, there are too many settlers in the West Bank. Israel's changed too much. The Palestinians have changed too much. There's no way to negotiate a 2-state solution. And continuing to talk about it as if it is actually just intensifies and concretizes oppression, because it's as if someday there'll be a two-state solution, so now we can continue to deny Palestinians any political rights whatsoever. The absence of that two-state solution now leaves us with a one-state reality. It's not a democratic state. And of course, now we're in a new stage with this new war.
Israeli leaders have argued that ceding territory only makes Israel less secure.
Many people who in the audience may have seen the movie Golda, about the Yom Kippur War, the 1973 war. The movie, only at the very last scene, which I won't give away, kind of subliminally tells the truth. And the truth is that war was caused by Golda Meir's unwillingness to withdraw from any territory in the Sinai. The whole idea after the Six-Day War was that Israel had was we're going to keep the Sinai and we won't have to attack again because we'll have the Sinai as a buffer. Moshe Dayan said, this is really not smart. We have a few soldiers on the Suez Canal, and the Egyptians could attack us at any time. We should have a demilitarized zone between us and the Egyptians, maybe a lot of the Sinai, and maybe that'd be the basis for peace. He wasn't the only one who suggested this to Golda Meir, but Golda Meir's idea was the more territory you have, the more secure you are, and that's just not true, even in military affairs. The result was that Israel lost 2,600 men in a war in 1973 and ultimately did give up the Sinai, and it became much more secure vis-a-vis Egypt because it withdrew from Sinai. So it's not true, and most Israelis realize that, the demands for territory in the West Bank have anything to do with security. It has to do with an ideological commitment that has grown under the influence of right-wing nationalism and religion and Jewish fundamentalism over the years since the 1967 war. Partly those are trends throughout the world, but partly they're a result of a certain logic that Zionism adopted. If you'll let me, I think I can explain quite a bit in a couple sentences. Zionist movement knew from the very beginning that if they were the Arabs, they would never accept Zionism. In fact, Jabotinsky, the leader of the revisionists, put it very well. He said, there's no living people that would ever agree to sacrifice its land to alien settlers like us. And the Arabs are no less a living people than the Sioux Indians on the prairies or the Papuans. They will never willingly agree to make Palestine a Jewish state. So what should we do? Because in the long run, we can't have a Jewish country in the Middle East without peace. But in the short run, we can't ever get them to give us what we need because it's directly contradictory to their fundamental needs as a nation. So his argument was we have to build an iron wall. This iron wall wasn't to keep out the Arabs. The idea was that the Arabs would keep throwing themselves against the iron wall and be defeated again and again. And finally, they would split into moderates and extremists. The extremists would never be able to deal with them, but you could make a deal with the moderates eventually, after they had given up hopes of getting all of Palestine. Ben-Gurion signed on to this as well. This was a kind of a brilliant way to deal with the reality that you could not get an agreement with the Arabs that would satisfy the minimum requirements of Zionism, because those requirements contradicted the minimum requirements of Palestinian self-determination. The strategy of the Iron Wall worked in large measure. The Arabs attacked again and again and were defeated again and again, and not just mildly defeated, they were crushingly defeated, just as Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion said they needed to be. And they were also correct that the Arabs eventually divided. After the Six-Day War, you had the acceptance front in the Arab world versus the rejection front. Those who accepted the reality of Israel, even if they didn't like it, versus those who rejected it as something that was ideologically intolerable. That's where the Iron Wall theory went to pot, because it assumed that once the Arabs split, that the Jewish side would say, oh, great, now we can negotiate a moderate solution. But instead, the Jews, after victory, expanded what they wanted. Why should we give the Arabs on the diplomatic table what they can't get on the battlefield? After all, the whole country was promised us. It really should be ours. We deserve it, and they're kind of barbaric. We've seen them fighting and killing our people. In other words, there was a misunderstanding in Jabotinsky's theory of the Iron Wall that the Jews could not keep expanding their demands. So when Israel took over the West Bank, although many Israelis said, okay, now let's make a deal with the Arab world. And the Arab world was fundamentally ready to make a deal. Instead, the right wing in Israel became more right wing, and the middle of the road people became right wing. And they all said, wow, we got the West Bank, we'll never leave. We got East Jerusalem, we'll never leave. We have Gaza, part of the land of Israel, we'll never leave. It's an inseparable part of the land of Israel. That's what Golda Meir said. It's an inseparable part of Israel. That's what she said about Gaza. You won't find that in the Golda movie because they're trying to make it look kind of sensible. What I'm trying to say is you want to understand in one little paragraph what happened in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's that the Iron Wall strategy worked partially. Since it only worked partially, what happened was that the Palestinians started to develop their own Iron Wall, their own use of force to convince Israel over time that they can't have everything. And this terrible, terrible, horrible thing that has happened is part of that struggle between two iron walls.
Well, both intifadas were crushed or ended in disaster, more so for the Palestinians than the Israelis. And I was just watching some remarks Benjamin Netanyahu gave sitting alongside Barack Obama in the White House in 2011, where they're talking about the possibility, Netanyahu brings this up, about going back to the 1967 borders. And Netanyahu said, well, those borders are indefensible. And secondly, he said, this is how he put it, there have been demographic changes to that land. What he meant is hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers, and you can't uproot these people now.
While Israel is prepared to make generous compromises for peace, it cannot go back to the 1967 lines. Because these lines are indefensible, because they don't take into account certain changes that have taken place on the ground, demographic changes that have taken place over the last 44 years.
There are about 700,000 Jewish Israelis living across the Green Line in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem now. It used to be in the 1980s that people would say if there were 100,000, it would be impossible for Israel ever to leave the West Bank. Now there are 7 times that, and Israel has changed dramatically. So, yes. But I'd tell you something else about that meeting in the White House, about that period of time, that people need to know about President Biden. Obama tried to achieve a moratorium on Israeli settlements at that time. And he thought if we could just get the Israelis to stop building settlements, maybe there's still a chance to restart the two-state solution peace process. He sent Biden to Israel with that message. Netanyahu was waiting for him. This was all about a moratorium on settlements, stop the settlements. As soon as Biden arrived, the day he arrived, Netanyahu announced the creation of a big new settlement right near Jerusalem. And this was a finger in the eye to Biden personally and a challenge to Obama saying, you think that you have the political clout in the United States to stop me? No, I have more political power in the United States than you do. Every time I come to the United States, I speak to a joint session of Congress and 20 to 30 standing ovations. How about you? So this meeting where Biden goes to Israel and Netanyahu clings to him and reads a statement that Biden and Blinken fundamentally dictated to him is an amazing personal reversal to what happened back in those days when he was vice president.
Never knew that. Final issue here, Ian, and thank you for this tour de force of the past 75 years. Even more, we went back to Balfour. Across the world today, there are examples, don't ask me to say how many, but there are examples of multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multilingual societies where people live in relative peace and stability, where they've managed to bury old hatchets after civil wars or ethnic cleansings, what have you. But no two situations are the same, and my view on this is one of almost no optimism at all. I guess my point is I don't see a good. I don't see a positive outcome.
Let me try to blow your mind on that.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, I also don't see a solution. But what I mean by a solution is not just a pretty picture of the future, which I have many pretty pictures. A solution is when you have a pretty picture of the future and you have a figured out a way to get to it. Now, when I used to be able to do that with the two-state solution, because negotiations, a victory of moderates in Israel, Fatah victory in the Palestinian Authority, a reasonable American president willing to take a few political risks, boom, you've got a two-state solution.
Today, the leadership of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization will sign a declaration of principles on interim Palestinian self-government. It charts a course toward reconciliation between two peoples who have both known the bitterness of exile.
Now that's not possible anymore. So I no longer have a solution. But I have pretty pictures in mind, and I know that politics never stops. So my tagline to remember right now is, there is no solution, what now? Now, I'm going to bring you back to the United States. Okay, Reconstruction is over. No one who fought the Civil War, even the abolitionists, ever imagined that Black Americans would be equal, would have political rights, that this would be a multiracial democracy. All they wanted, the abolition movement, was to end slavery. Lincoln's own position was that the blacks would go back to Africa because his main concern was stopping miscegenation. At least that's what he said.
He dropped that position.
He dropped that. And his few speeches on it, that's what he emphasized. And I can go into detail, but you're right, he'd stopped talking about it. But he never talked about how terrific it would be to have a multiracial democracy, that all black men deserved equal political rights. By 1876, the deal that made that allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to be president and Tilden not to be, even though he won, as the Democrat won the election, is to end Reconstruction and let the South put the blacks in the South back into neo-slavery through lynching, through Jim Crow. That's the world we're in, okay, Martin? We're back there. Now look ahead and ask yourself, is there any solution to this problem? No whites essentially recognize blacks as even human? Are we ever going to have a multiracial democracy? And you would say, no, I can't see it. What to do? The fact is that over time, in a partial democracy like we had, certain groups start to have interest in emancipating other groups because they need their votes. Women, for example, because the United States wasn't a real democracy till women got the vote. Men ruled and women didn't. How did that happen? The men and women didn't sit down and negotiate, and the men said, okay, women, you now actually deserve the vote. Some men who were in power were about to be displaced by other men, and they saw in the women's movement an opportunity to get votes against their male challenger. Similarly, Democrats who were relying on racism for so long to win elections came eventually to see they needed black voters in order to win. That changed their position, and now no Democrat can hope to reach the White House or win an election without a massive turnout of black voters. How long did that take? A long time, and we're not done yet.
One long lifetime.
When you look at Israel now, and I include in Israel, I include Gaza and the West Bank inside the country. They're in no other country. They're mainly what goes on in those areas are as a result of Israeli decisions. Israel controls, as we know, all the water, all the electricity, all the fuel, all the electromagnetic fields, all the airwaves around Gaza, for example, the fishing rights, everything. Once you see it as one country, how long does a country like that take to democratize in the sense of extending rights to groups that have been stigmatized and excluded but live in the country? And what we find is that form of democratization takes a very long time. And it's not planned. It just happens as a result of people needing to empower other people so that they can win against their opponents.
Well, you said it right. Politics never stops. There were anti-slavery politics in this country even before the Declaration of Independence was signed. You can't explain the coming of the Civil War without reference to anti-slavery politics, and not just at the federal level. I don't know the Middle East as well as you do. I hope that this kind of politics in Israel can gain steam.
Look at the last few elections. The sort of moderate government that existed before this last Netanyahu government existed because an Arab party for the first time became part of the coalition. And that Arab party, the United Arab Party, led by people who were trained in the same schools as Hamas. They come right out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the group who basically said, okay, we accept Israel as a Jewish state. Now give us a bigger piece of the pie. We're going to play the political game. And you need us because nobody can form a government without us. That's new in Israel, but it's a big step forward in which Jewish parties can no longer, on the left or in moderate parties, no longer can denounce Arabs because they need the Arabs to come out and vote for them. They need the Arabs to vote for their own parties so that there'll be a potential coalition other than Netanyahu. So politics like this has started. Now, the war that we are seeing now will set this whole process back. But we saw it already developing in the last several years faster than I had anticipated.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time. As I explained on the eve of the summit, success was far from guaranteed. given the historical, religious, political, and emotional dimensions of the conflict. Still, because the parties were not making progress on their own and the September deadline they set for themselves was fast approaching, I thought we had no choice. We can't afford to leave a single stone unturned in the search for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to return our attention to U.S. domestic politics. What is Bidenomics? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive.
Are you driving your car or doing the laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too.
Having these two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save over $775 on average.
Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $779 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.